collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up this week, it's EU election time.
The next election will be win for people that don't want to go to vote. I think that people that will go to vote could be maybe from 50 to 60%, so not so much.
The launch of a new book by a local author.
He starts to get these feelings of a repressed memory of a past relationship, and gradually those memories sort of force their way into his present, into his everyday life, and become more and more powerful and more troubling. And he basically fails to cope with them over the course of a week and then goes into a psychological decline.
Former British Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott on the Ukraine crisis.
What we've got to do is have more JoJo, not ruddy war. And whilst it's a new line being driven across Europe between East and West, that can only mean more tension, more Cold War, more resources into defence when most of the countries can't afford the kind of scale of money and these nuclear weapons.
And Scottish actor Matthew McVarish on the road to change, raising awareness about child sexual abuse.
It's no great mystery if you look at the amount of people in any society who are homeless or drug abuse or suffering from depression. You'll find a large percent of these people have been sexually abused in their childhood, and quite a large percentage have never really spoken about it.
The European Union Parliament elections take place this weekend. Nathan Morley has been in Brussels to gauge the mood.
Well, I'm standing on the glitzy, shiny white TV studio set, which was especially constructed on the third floor of the European Parliament. Now, it's on this stage that the leading candidates for the presidency of the European Commission have been arguing their policy and vision for the future of Europe.
It's election time. Welcome to Euronet Plus Big Crunch presidential debate, broadcasting live across Europe. The European elections...
Liberal Democrat Guy Verhofstadt, Martin Schulz from the Social Democrats, Ska Keller from the Greens and Jean-Claude Juncker, the nominee for the centre-right European People's Party, were the stars of the show. But even political junkies are divided on whether the debate was exhilarating, exhausting, or just some kind of strange little sideshow.
On Greece, let's say it like it is. The real reason of the difficulties in Greece are not Europe, or the clientelistic system existing in the country. Professions are not open, the markets are not open, the banks are public banks who are in a bad shape.
The European Union was always a promise, not only for peace, it was a promise for more solidarity, for growth, for jobs.
Clearly austerity has not worked. It has actually destroyed something that I would call the European dream.
I'm not a fan of austerity. I'm in favour of fiscal rigour, because without fiscal rigour we cannot bring Europe out of the crisis.
So will such debates get people to the ballot boxes? One of the consistent themes underlying European politics since the late 1970s has been voter apathy. Some claim that the dwindling turnout undermines the Parliament's claim to democratic legitimacy. Dario Cirincione from the Italian Sky television channel tells me that Brussels does not provoke much excitement in the popular press.
The next election will be win for people that don't want to go to vote. I think that people that will go to vote could be maybe from 50 to 60%. So not so much. And it's not easy for European Union to find space on the newspaper or on the media or on television in Italy, and usually the Italian press speak not well for European Union. So people think that is an institution very, very far from us.
That's not the case, according to Klaus Welle, the Secretary-General of the European Parliament. He says the emergence of visible personalities will help get people to the ballot box. He also predicts the percentage of eligible voters will actually rise.
I think we have a fair chance. At least we see that currently the intention to go to the elections all over Europe is 3% up compared to the same moment last time. So I think by personalizing the campaign, by people also giving a choice who should chair the European Commission, who should be the president, we have a much better chance to have a turnaround. Whether it's going to happen, we have to see on the 25th of May. And of course, finally it's a decision of the citizens themselves.
The debates have primarily focused on one major issue so far. That's economics. And with Europe in the midst of its worst financial crisis in 50 years, critics of the bloc say that Brussels underestimated just how big an impact forced austerity measures would have on some member states, especially those in southern Europe like Greece and Cyprus. The term forced austerity makes Jean-Claude Trichet, the former president of the European Central Bank, cringe when I mention the phrase.
I don't think these are forced austerity programs. In my opinion, these are voluntary programs that permit countries to go back to balance when they were heavily imbalanced. That's the idea. And I hope very much that we will see progressively all countries concerned, as is now the case, regaining confidence, regaining creditworthiness, and getting out of this dramatic period back to growth and jobs creation.
But these elections are not just about the financial crisis. The sudden rise of left and right populist and nationalist parties across the continent could see them snatch a big chunk of the votes. A central theme, as outlined by the UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage, is immigration. His party wants an end to further political and economic integration and completely disagrees with the free movement of labour, which is a central principle of the European Union. His hostility to Brussels has struck a chord with the British public.
Now, the debate in Britain has changed, and now it's about immigration. People in Britain are shocked at the change in every single city and market town since we opened the doors to Eastern Europe in 2004, and I have nothing against Bulgarians or Romanians, but it is unacceptable that we should open our doors to them unconditionally.
The True Finns in Finland, the Danish People's Party in Denmark, the Front National in France, and the Freedom Party in the Netherlands have similar concerns. And calculations by the Open Europe think tank suggest that anti-EU parties could win more than 30% of the vote across the continent. But paradoxically, this could actually bring the more traditional parties closer together to try and resist the anti-European tide.
We have to take into consideration that these parties do not necessarily work well together.
That's Paul Ivan, a junior policy analyst at the European Policy Centre, a think tank committed to making European integration work.
So even if at national level some of these parties will get a good share of the votes, they have a very bad history of working together at the European level because of the type of parties that they are, very focused on national issues. They have trouble working with their counterparts, trouble incorporating. There also great diversity of views between them on many of these issues: migration, role of Islam, role of the EU, there's mild Euroscepticism, then the stronger Euroscepticism. So we might not have a very influential, let's say, Eurosceptic group at the level of the European Parliament.
Outgoing German MEP Jürgen Klut reckons that the large, diverse and increasingly sceptical voters across the European Union may do one of two things.
There are two possibilities. The crisis could say to the people, or one consequence could be to say, no, we don't want to deal any longer with the EU. Or the opposite could be to say, yes, we understood, meanwhile, that Europe, that the EU is an important issue, and we have to take part in the elections. And I hope that that's the direction we'll be.
One thing, though, is for sure. These elections could threaten the unity and perhaps even the survival of the EU and achieve something that had once seemed impossible, that many of those elected into this chamber actually want to see it closed down. Nathan Morley, the Cyprus News Digest at the European Parliament in Brussels.
Next Thursday, May the 29th, local author and poet Paul Stewart will be launching his book Now Then. It's all happening at the Iomolovites Community Centre in Nicosia. Now, he's well known for his work on Samuel Beckett and indeed for his poetry, but this is the first time, I think, Paul, that you've moved into at least published fiction. Why the change?
I've always written fiction. Change of circumstances meant that I focused more on poetry for a while. But this is the second novel I've written, but the first to be published. So it's always been going on in the background, and just looking for the opportunity and the publisher who's willing to take it on, really.
So where's the first one that you wrote?
It's unpublished. It's just sitting on my computer, pretty much.
Why wasn't it published?
I never even tried with that one. It didn't end up working, I don't think. It had some good bits in it, but it was a first attempt that didn't quite go as I wanted to, I don't think.
Let us into the secret of writing. I mean, is it something that takes over your life and sort of develops itself, or have you had to work at it?
Oh, you always have to work at it. That idea of inspiration and just pouring it out just doesn't work, I don't think. So it does take a lot of sort of focused time and concentration. And that can be tricky, because, you know, we've all got other lives to live and jobs to do. So trying to maintain that focus over a long period of time is probably the hardest aspect of it all.
And how long did it take you to write?
I think it took me about 3 years.
That's a fair chunk of somebody's life. So how do you feel now that it's printed and you're moving on to the next step?
I feel great about it. It's a great relief to actually have it out there and people already reading on it and commenting on it on Amazon and things. And it feels very good to have it, you know, not just sitting there in my office, but actually doing some work of its own, which is exactly what I want.
So tell us about it. And what is it? Where did the idea come from?
Well, I don't know where the idea came from. It's set in the UK, it's set mainly in Bristol, with forays into Nottingham and also over into Spain.
Places that you are familiar with, presumably.
Yeah,
they always say you write about places you know.
Well, yes, there's no place in the novel that's somewhere I don't know pretty well. And I was talking to another writer friend the other day, and we both agreed that it just helps. You don't have to imagine absolutely everything. You know where the street goes, you know what's on the street, you know if you turn around that corner there, you get to a pub, and you can just weave all that into the fiction, and it just gives you sort of coordinates to work with. Just physical coordinates are really helpful in that way.
Brings it to life, I guess. So what is it about? Is it?
Well, it's about the main protagonist is a guy called John Matthews, very ordinary, early 30s bloke, happily married, not yet with children. And over the course of a single week, the chapters follow in days, he starts to get these feelings of a repressed memory of a past relationship. And gradually those memories sort of force their way into his present, into his everyday life, and become more and more powerful and more troubling. And he basically fails to cope with them over the course of a week and goes into a psychological decline, despite his wife's best efforts. So it's not a comedy, I think it's safe to say. But that's basically the premise of it. I wanted to bring together that, as the title Now Then suggests, bring together past and present in a very forcible relationship.
So you're looking, in a sense, at human psychology.
Yeah.
You've got an interest in that, presumably, from your literature interests. But,
yeah.
Do you know much about it, or is any of this based on people you know or yourself?
The psychological aspects of it are not. I have a bit of a muck around with things that I've picked up from Freud and Jung and things like that, which I've picked up over the years. But there's no personal psychological history there or anything like that, or indeed anyone I've known. I mean, you've all known people who've gone through rough patches, so it's not exactly uncommon. But no, it's a fictional, how can I put it, study, in a way, of just how desperately strong the past can be in one's own present life.
Especially if you don't face it.
Especially if you don't face it. I mean, and if you don't face it, it will come back, no matter what you try and do. If it pops out in dreams or just an accident on the street sort of brings it all flooding back, or whatever it might be.
So has this got you out of the poetry? Are you now in?
No, still writing poetry. I've got another event coming up on that with Ideogramma, I think, in June. So the poetry is still ticking over. It's still something that I love doing. And the prose is still ticking over as well. just about finishing off another novel, which hopefully someone will want as well. So yeah, it's on all fronts at the moment.
So where can people come along and see you? I think you've got a little sort of reception evening planned.
Yes, the author Eve Makis will be introducing my work. She's an author who actually comes from Nottingham, where I do, although she's from Cypriot parentage. She's got 3 or 4 novels which are very successful, and she's going to come up and introduce the works. And I'll be reading from Now Then and signing as well. So at 7:30 on the 29th of May.
Next Thursday.
Next Thursday. At the IS Homologides Cultural Centre on Angelos Street. And yes, it'll be wine and reception, and I'll be reading from the work, so people will get at least some sense of where it's going, I think.
Okay, and the start time?
7:30.
Author Paul Stewart talking about his new book, Now Then. Now, the big story in Cyprus this week has been the visit of the American Vice President Joe Biden, the first US Vice President to visit the island since Lyndon Johnson back in 1962. Mr. Biden had contacts with both Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot leadership. There has, as usual, been a lot of rhetoric from the party leaders about the visit, but it does bring renewed hope of a solution to the island's long-standing division. Indeed, Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu said after flying to Cyprus to confer with Turkish Cypriot leader Dervish Eroglu last week that this wasn't an ordinary visit. Apart from the Cyprus problem, there were also discussions about energy and the role that Cyprus gas deposits could play in regional stability. Other stories: the Cyprus Football Association is to strengthen its punitive measures for clubs which don't control fans' violent behaviour, although the 3-strike rule they propose still leaves some leeway, and many people expected tougher sanctions after the cup final was stopped when a player was injured by a firecracker thrown at him last weekend. But while football yet again is in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, Cyprus national rugby team, the Mouflons, covered themselves in glory, beating Hungary 46-13 last Saturday and extending their world record of consecutive wins to 23. This, however, got very little press coverage. It seems the media in Cyprus aren't interested in good news stories. Lord Prescott serves on the monitoring committee of the Council of Europe, and of course the current big story that you're dealing with, I think, is Ukraine. It's a crisis that has, I think, got everybody fairly well on tenterhooks. It seems to move forward, then it moves back. We do seem now to have had a little bit of a step back from the brink by Russia. What's the view of the Monitoring Committee of the Council of Europe on the whole situation?
Well, first of all, Ukraine belongs to the Council of Europe. She's a member of the Council of Europe, signs up for our human rights and all the things that she does in that convention. She's not in the EU. She's not in NATO, and that's what's causing a great deal of the concern. And so what we need to do is, how do we reduce this tension there? That's clearly what we want to do. But you know, I've been concerned for a while. I was sent by Tony Blair in 2004 to meet the bidding prime ministers for entry into the EU. Britain was in favour of them coming in to enlarge the community because it didn't want federal Europe, so they were up to the enlargement. But I met the Polish Prime Minister, and he said to me, I want to be in the European Union, because that means NATO, and NATO will protect me against the Russians. And I had to say to him, well, you know, do you honestly believe if Russia invades Poland, NATO forces will come in? And he said, yes, that's collective security. I said, don't you think you're in danger of repeating history in Poland? And now I say that is what has happened with Ukraine. We've encouraged all these countries to come into the EU, first into the Council of Europe, then into the EU, and members of NATO. It is the fear of Russia which we have to recognise has done that. But what I feared would happen, and I think it's happened now, and I've been saying this in the British cabinet when I was in, you remove these buffer states in circumstances that looks political, that basically these were the ones Russia took over for security against the West, and all those fears in the Cold War. What's going to happen then? Somewhere in Russia, whether for nationalist reasons or military reasons, they're going to react. And when you get to Ukraine, you're right in the middle of it. So what's happening in the Ukraine now, this is my view, is exactly what I feared and brought about the belief in Poland and these Eastern European countries that somehow NATO would intervene. Now I hear these generals talking about, we'll put certain troops in these Eastern European countries. What do you mean as hostages in case they invade? What we've got to do is have more jaw, not ruddy war. And whilst it's a new line being driven across Europe between East and West, that can only mean more tension, more Cold War, more resources into defence when most of the countries can't afford the kind of scale of money and these nuclear weapons. So the Council of Europe has had a meeting with you, I think only a month or so, to talk about this. But I think the Council of Europe has been shoved on the sidelines. Why? Because America's not in the Council of Europe, quite honest. America's in the Organisation of Security in Europe, and they're ones that sent out a monitor. But the Americans have made it clear, haven't they, from my point of view? They have the ambassador in Kiev going around handing sandwiches to people who want to get rid of the elected president. You then get those that you send the troops in. The vice president goes there, the Secretary of State from America goes there, and the chairman of the CIA goes there. Now, it doesn't look as if you're being particularly impartial from the West side, and we've got a division. And the Russians now have played it very cannily. I can't say I can endorse or approve it, but it's come from this silly policy of actually ideologically pushing forward the boundaries and keeping the division in Europe but nearer to Russia. Now, in the Council of Europe, we should be beginning to insert ourselves to say, this is a member of the Council of Europe. It has obligations to us. Not easy. It is very much divided. These circumstances are difficult. But I wish we could get rid of the East-West ideology and talk about Europe. Russia is a European nation. As far as I'm aware, America is not. And at the moment, it's a bit out of balance.
Where do you think it will end, though? We've already had the annexation of Crimea. We've apparently got large numbers of Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine demanding that they join Russia.
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly true. I think the West tends to pay more attention to the Western case that's going on there, right? But look what's happening in Kiev. I mean, we've all been concerned about that. And we got rid of an elected government, like it or not. Something happened in Egypt as well. We do seem to be on the side sometimes of getting rid of the elected person, though it was a terrible situation in Ukraine. So what we've got to go back is to what we had prior to this new Cold War, because that's what it's heading for, under the place where Cold War finished. Nations talked to each other, we reduced their nuclear weapons, even Russia agreed, to be honest, that Ukraine and Crimea would be an independent state. They've offended against that agreement. But what we've brought about now is the rise of nationalism. God blimey, we know in Europe what nationalism does. I see there's the big opening of that big museum, something today, isn't it now, where the Archduke was shot 100 years ago. It just reminds us of the sensitivities in this part of Europe, of nationalism, of militarism, of the worst kind of thing. We've seen it in Bosnia, Serbia, all the way through. All these things are being awakened again. Religious, political, military. We've just got to get away from those forces. Not easy, but it's the only way, because the alternative is to bring in demanding more nuclear weapons, which we already hear the military, now NATO, saying we need more troops. The reality is the military intervention can't work. The Americans have agreed that. All the European leaders have agreed that. For God's sake, if the military won't work, it can only be diplomatic. But when I read that the monitors that they sent in under that American-inspired group, the monitors they sent in said, we're not soldiers, we're just diplomats in uniforms. And they come from the Ukraine. I don't know who's governing this strategy, but I think the politicians, and I would hope in the Council of Europe, will recognise we must play a part. Can't offer to solve it. We're still arguing between Georgia and Russia, between Armenia, Azerbaijan. All those are wars still going on. In a way, internal disputes, and we must try to do it. What I'm sure about, there's no military solution to it.
The other problem, of course, is the energy, because if things go that way. It could be that the taps are turned off, and energy security is one of Europe's biggest, I think, fears. What would happen in that sort of case?
Well, energy is a quite critical part. It's not new to us. The Arab countries on oil have been using it very effectively God knows how many years. You know, when I first started in politics, I mean, it was about $10 a barrel. So now it's about $120 a barrel. No, that's the effective of energy. It does have an effect, there's no doubt about it. But, you know, what was happening here is that half of Ukraine wanted to go into the European Union. The other half wanted to stay with Russia. Both of them, it's a pretty bankrupt state, isn't it? So the West comes along, gives a lot of money through the IMF, gives a lot of money support EU. The Russians then were giving it to their organisation. Both of them are at it. In this case, energy's played a part because that's one of the things they've got. It would be terrible for Europe to get in a war about energy, about do you get the gas if in fact you don't politically agree with them. I think in the Ukraine they had an agreement with Russia, they had an agreement with the EU. It split them. And then energy came to the fore. Why? Because we're heavily dependent on energy. Ask Merkel in Germany. It's not easy just to say we'll turn all the taps off. So there are difficult problems, but they are part of the geopolitical situation we have. And the only way it can solve that is more and more Georgia. It won't be solved by war.
And do you think that Putin is up for the Georgia? Because he is a fairly canny politician, it seems. I think
we've all agreed. He's a lot more canny than the people who are giving him credit for. There's no doubt about that. Look, he looks a bit... You know, those powers that come from the back of their security and all that, you know, I'm as suspicious in Russia as I am of America in that sense. But what we have here is a nation like Russia acting in the way that it does. Putin, obviously, what's it done? It's fed the feelings of nationalism in Russia, isn't it? At the end of the day, don't forget, when you think of Russia, we sent in the white troops when they had the revolution to try and overthrow the revolution, when the people were overthrown by revolutionary people. And then in the Second World War, I was brought up as a child, I was born just before the war, and all our papers had the Cossacks and how the Russians were fighting the Germans, and they were the heroes. Right? And then it got to the Cold War and they become the villains. They've gone from heroes to villains, etc. We must understand. And what I do fear most of all, because nationalism has brought us world wars, there's no doubt about that. Even the arguments about the Germans saying, let's go into air because we've got a majority of Germans. It has an echo, doesn't it, when people say we've got the majority of Russians. But when you look at how we tie our boundaries, look at Bosnia and Serbia, all this, we just impose situations on them. I don't know that we made it any better, but at the end of the day, it's still Georgia. And it might go on for years as it's going in the Council of Europe. We can't solve Georgia and Russia. They hate each other. But we try to keep some balance and keep on talking. And I think that's the only way. Because they accept you can't solve it by military. Only military men think that. And even them have got doubts now.
John Prescott, former British Deputy Prime Minister, talking to me during his visit to Nicosia last week with the Council of Europe committees. Child sexual abuse crosses every socio-economic boundary. It doesn't discriminate. People from all walks of life have been convicted across countries all over the world. Well, the Road to Change project is happening at the moment in the European Union. It is, in fact, a 16,000-kilometre walk around the EU, and it's a bid to raise awareness and to stop the silence that surrounds child sexual abuse. With me is Scottish actor and writer Matthew McVarish. He's the European ambassador for the international NGO Stop the Silence, Stop Child Sexual Abuse. 16,000 kilometres is asking some. Are you a sportsman as well on the side, Matthew?
Do you know, I'm really not. Like, before I started walking, there's nothing sporty about me at all. And back in the UK, I'm in children's television, so my agent insists that I stay in shape because I'm an actor, but really, no, I've never done anything like this before.
So, did you go into training before you started?
I got some advice from a fellow Scot, Mark Beaumont. He cycled around the world, and he did it for sportsman reasons. I'm doing it to raise awareness. So he gave me some advice on injury prevention. But I've lost about 15 kilos, and I've been walking now for 11 months. So yeah, but I'm getting more athletic with it. I mean, I'm learning as I go, but yeah, this is really new to me.
So tell us about some of the places you've stopped off so far and how you've managed to raise that awareness. It is something that people don't like to talk about, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I'm the ambassador for the organisation Stop the Silence, and as you can see, I'm trying to raise awareness of child sexual abuse. We're not called, the organisation isn't called Catch the Predators or anything like that, because this issue exists in silence, and I'm trying to raise awareness of a situation that nobody wants to talk about. So, I mean, many years ago when I was a child, I seen the movie Forrest Gump, and people often compare me to that guy because he was running across America, and if you've ever seen the movie, there's a scene when journalists run to him and say, "Why are you doing this? Are you running for world peace? Are you running for equal rights?" And he himself in the story apparently was just running. But I thought there's an opportunity there. See, I wanted to raise awareness of child sexual abuse across the EU, but I have no money. So how do you get how do you get on television, on newspapers, on radio in 32 nations without any money? I was like, well, if I simply walk, then people will ask me, why are you doing this? Because it's extraordinary. And that's what's happened. I've now been on television, radio, and newspapers. This is the 21st country that I've reached. Yeah, we've even been translated into Russian when I was in Estonia. So yeah, my plan is working.
And what sort of coverage are you getting in terms of maybe follow-ups even after you've moved on to the next country?
Well, it's extraordinary because if you can imagine, many people in Europe live in very rural areas. I walk to the capital of each country because that's where the media is based and that's where the government are, and most of the NGOs work out of. But the majority of the population are in smaller rural places. When these people read about me in their newspaper, their national news, they contact me through my website, roadtochange.eu. And in quite a number of cases, I've had to pass these emails on to the police because the information they've given me has been revealed a child protection issue that's happening right now. And so I hadn't expected this being a consequence, but because I've walked through 21 countries, we've created a number of criminal investigations, as well as all the awareness that we're raising, and we've also encouraged some legislative change in a couple of countries, which is another thing I'm trying to do.
When you say that you've had to pass on information to the police, I'm presuming that you do that with the permission, do you, of the people who've come to you? Because that's another issue. When we say stop the silence, we're not just talking about encouraging people who have been abused to speak out. Mm-hmm. We're also, I'm imagining, talking about the general population not being quite so afraid to address these issues in public and show that it's not acceptable.
Well, what we now understand is that when a child is sexually abused, it creates, imagine, invisible trauma, and that exists in their mind, and that will manifest in their life later in different ways. So it's important to talk about that. It's important to break the silence as the victim so that you can actually recover and process the trauma. So that's the first reason you want to stop the silence. And the second one is prevention, because very often the victim is the only person who knows what that person is capable of. And if the person who sexually abused you has never been reported, then how do you know that they're not creating more victims, today or tomorrow or next week? And believe me, because my uncle sexually abused me, and I appreciate how difficult it is to make that step, because in Scotland it's a very Catholic, very conservative community that I grew up in. But I knew that my uncle was dangerous, and I knew that he was still possibly in contact with children. So for reasons of other children's safety, I stepped forward and I made the reports.
A very brave thing to do. How old were you when you did that?
Well, it was relatively recently. I was 25. I'm now 31, so it was 6 years ago when I kind of broke the silence. But at that time, my 3 brothers who had also been sexually abused were struggling. They were all medicated for depression. They had never spoken to their wives about what my uncle had done to us. And I could just see how the damage that my uncle had done to them, psychologically, was manifesting in their lives in kind of depression and anxiety. And it's no great mystery if you look at the amount of people in any society who are homeless or drug abuse or suffering from depression. You'll find a large percent of these people have been sexually abused in their childhood, and quite a large percentage have never really spoken about it. So child sexual abuse is so much more damaging to the individual and to society as a whole than people generally realise.
And what are you doing in Cyprus, or what have you been doing in Cyprus? Because it is a whistle-stop tour, isn't it, around the capital cities?
It's unique. Normally I walk 50 kilometres a day and there's a vehicle that follows me and I sleep in the vehicle. Of course, Cyprus is an island, so it was unique. I landed Saturday morning. I landed in Larnaca. I walked immediately off the plane all the way to Nicosia.
You had a lot of meetings while you were here too, didn't you?
Yeah, I met the Ministry of Education, and Stop the Silence that I represent have training for teachers and anyone who deals with children in the public sector. So we're now we're sharing information about what training we can provide and what training already exists here, which I have to say is very hopeful. Cyprus seems to have very, very good and up-to-date procedures, and the laws here are much more advanced than some of the countries that I've just came through, Romania and Bulgaria, where the situation is not as hopeful for the children there as it is here. But that's not to say that there isn't still a presence of child sexual abuse here that's going unreported. So this week raised some awareness, spoke in newspapers. We also had a reception with the British High Commissioner, and I got to meet some of your parliamentary individuals. So it's about raising awareness. It's about the first thing is to raise awareness so that people come forward, and the next thing is to try and encourage political change, and where possible, I meet NGOs and encourage best practice collaboration internationally.
And this is all available on the website as well. There's a lot of information on there.
Yep, roadtochange.eu is because the project, the Road to Change, is the big walk, but it's a project organised and supported by Stop the Silence, Stop Child Sexual Abuse. So if you want to just read about child sexual abuse, go.
StopTheSilence.org. Pleasure talking to you. Good luck with the rest of the journey. When's it going to finish?
I've still got 8,000 kilometres to go, so I'll reach Edinburgh in February.
Matthew McVarish on The Road to Change. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.